Hello, in this video clip we will review how to construct a case and how to make a convincing argument. So case construction, the elements of the argument. What are the elements of the argument? Some of the more important elements are addressed by Simon Fraser University on their website How to Debate. First, they discuss the introduction. Here you will outline the case that your group will be making. It is important to briefly address the major parts of your case, or the topic sentences for your individual arguments here, and to explain the general direction of your argument. They say that it is important to state your introduction briefly in order to leave time for the more important issue of delivering your arguments. They also discuss the conclusion. Once all group members have spoken and delivered the argument, someone must summarize the group's argument and relate, quote, what your group has said and why, end quote. So continuing on with case construction and the elements of the argument, there's a process behind the construction of a case, which will be discussed here. When preparing an argument, it is important that you make an outline for your case. This will be presented before you deliver the individual arguments. It is often referred to as your introduction. Here you state your argument, the position your group will be taking on an issue, your main arguments, and the conclusion at which your group has arrived. When you are dividing up the work, you should divide the case into parts. The parts include the following: an introduction, several arguments, and a conclusion. There should be, quote, between 2 and 4 arguments, end quote. And each team member should be assigned a part that they will prepare and possibly present. Another interesting idea is anticipating or expecting counter-arguments, that is, objections to your view. You might also anticipate or expect counter-arguments to your view and assign the task of anticipating these or considering these to a team member. Each argument should have at least 3 reasons that support the topic, and they should be outlined by a team member when they present their argument. Case construction, how to make a convincing case. According to SFU, both logic and evidence are very important for constructing a case. They say that it is important to use logic to support your arguments, and, quote, evidence to support your points, end quote. Evidence for them includes, quote, examples, statistics, and quotes, end quote. It is very important to include evidence that supports your points in your argument. When preparing a case, taking notes is very important. You should create headings, and underneath them explain your thinking. Subheadings can also be used to separate your evidence. And the most important arguments should come first, of course. So continuing on with case construction. As I already mentioned, your introduction should state your position on an issue. It should identify at least 2 supporting arguments. Below is an example of an introduction for a case which argues that people should not be allowed to use cell phones when driving. Your thesis statement might resemble the following. Statement: drivers should not be allowed to use cell phones when driving because it causes them to become distracted. It increases the risk of car accidents. There are 3 reasons that I will discuss that support my view. First, cell phones stop people from focusing on the road. People cannot do 2 or more things at one time. Therefore, they cannot focus on the road and speak on their cell phones at the same time. Second, cell phones make people less physically coordinated and interfere with their natural reflexes. Therefore, using a cell phone when driving increases the risk of car accidents. Third, cell phones interfere with sight and cause people to become distracted from their environment. It causes them to care less about those around them and more about the person on the phone. Therefore, using a cell phone when driving increases the risk of car accidents. Then you would like to have a concluding sentence, and voila, your introductory paragraph is done. As you may have noticed, each of these reasons can be argued against or proven otherwise. According to SFU, that is fine. The point is not to establish a truth that cannot be proven wrong, but to make a convincing case. And your case is meant to persuade your audience. Rebuttal. The rebuttal is a very important part of your argument, and in it you will be arguing against something that the opposing team has said. In general, you'll be arguing against all portions of the opposing team's argument. According to Simon Fraser University, the most effective way of making a rebuttal is by showing that your opponent's arguments are either, quote, factually, morally, or logically flawed, end quote. They refer to several examples of flawed arguments that appear in Andy Kidd's work, 2002 work, A Rough Guide to Debating. It is here worth reviewing some of these arguments to see how they are flawed. So the first that Andy Kidd includes in his book is the idea of compulsory euthanasia. So number one, quote, compulsory euthanasia at age 70 would save the country money in pensions and health care. Indeed, end quote. Indeed, decreasing the number of aging civilians would decrease the stress that an aging population places on our healthcare system, but this argument is, quote, morally flawed, end quote. We cannot wish that those who are elderly should not live just because they place an economic strain on our healthcare system, and that is quite clear. Number two, quote, banning cigarette product placement in films will cause more young people to smoke because it will make smoking more mysterious and taboo, end quote. According to SFU, this argument is, quote, logically flawed, end quote, because this law would be, quote, more likely, end quote, to prevent the media from presenting images that make smoking seem appealing. And third, my partner will then look at the economic issues, end quote. Blah, blah, blah. 5 minutes later and still no mention of the economic issues. According to SFU, this argument is logically flawed as it fails to fulfill one of the conditions that it sets out for itself in the introduction. How to rebut your opponent's argument. According to SFU, it is important to have an overview of your opponent's arguments in order to, quote, identify what their key arguments are, end quote. They say that using the above-mentioned techniques are invaluable, but that they must be used appropriately, and that it is not sufficient, it's not adequate to merely, quote, rebut a few random arguments here and there, end quote. That is, you must have an overview or a general sense of your opposing team's argument and be able to refute each of their arguments. Below are some questions that you can ask yourself when viewing your opponent's case. Answering these questions can help you to, quote, systematically break down, end quote, your opponent's case. Number one, how have my opponents approached their case? Are there flaws in their strategy? 2, what tasks have my opponents, quote, set themselves, end quote? Have they failed to deliver any of these? 3, what is the, quote, general emphasis, end quote, of their case? What, quote, assumptions, end quote, does it make? How might these assumptions be flawed? 4, how might their major arguments be flawed? Are they consistent? Do they contradict themselves in the, quote, key areas, end quote, of the case? Now that you know how to construct a case and have the skills to become an effective debater, I hope that you will continue to develop these. Thank you and have a good day.